2022 is truly becoming the year of the smooth brain opinion. Fuck's sake. Whether it's whitewashed pro-Ukraine narrative building on one side or brainless contrarianism for rage clicks on the other, it seems everyone on the internet's a fucking international relations expert these days. In reality, both sides of this argument are just dribbling fucking morons who exist on the wrong end of the Dunning-Kruger effect and could probably benefit from opening a book or two. Look, the situation in Ukraine's fucking impossible to objectively understand unless you're a 600 IQ very stable genius with an expertise in geopolitics, history, economics, international relations, and foreign policy. Obviously none of us are these things, so it's all just incoherent screeching from a pack of internet fucking spastics. Anyway, that being said, on to Jake. Jake's the fucking perfect example of what I was just saying about the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is put simply the observed tendency for actual experts on a topic to underrate their level of expertise, while noobs think they know it all because they're still too ignorant to know the shit they don't know yet. Jake's generally considered quite a good YouTuber. He gets a lot of praise for his compelling scripts and good editing, and I guess that gave him the idea he could weigh in on the Ukraine war and not look like a total window-licking mouth breather, but oh boy was he wrong. Before I get into the video, I want to mention that in general I enjoy the fuck out of Jake's content. His shit's just a level of quality I could never even hope to match. I have nothing but respect for him as a YouTuber and a content creator. That said, his take on the Russia-Ukraine thing's out of touch, ignorant, and brain dead. Honestly, most of the shit on the internet about this issue is dumb because, as I said, it seems every teenager and housewife on the internet is a geopolitics genius these days. Clearly they, along with Jake, learned the thousands of years of European history necessary to truly understand the current crisis in like 2 weeks. Now see fit to educate the rest of us. Jake's video starts off by making the stupidest false equivalence I've ever heard in my fucking life, by comparing the Euro-Atlantic aspirations, as NATO called it, of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova to a hypothetical US-China war that resulted in New York and California forcibly being spun off into their own sovereign nations with Chinese puppet leaders and Chinese missiles. This isn't even comparing apples and oranges, it's comparing apples to fucking antimatter. Europe and Russia are very, very old civilizations that stretch back literally thousands of years with a long and storied history of kicking the shit out of each other near constantly. There are deep cultural and linguistic differences between European nations and empires and has been for centuries throughout their whole history. America, on the other hand, is a baby of a country compared to the rest of the world, with barely any history to speak of. It's culturally homogenous for the most part. By this, I mean a Californian and a New Yorker will both call themselves Americans, they'll both most likely share a language, have grown up with similar media and influences, believe broadly the same things about their place in the world, and so on. This leads to the second reason it's a stupid comparison. China kicking the shit out of the US and then forcibly balkanizing individual states to use them as military bases is fundamentally different to Ukraine being voluntarily given independence after the fall of the Soviet Union and then pursuing NATO membership of its own volition. New Yorkers fundamentally want to be part of the USA. China would have to use military force to separate them. The Americans would fight it. Ukrainians, however, for the most part, don't really want to be a part of Russia. They don't see themselves as Russian and voluntarily leapt at the opportunity to gain NATO membership as protection from what they see as an oppressive Russian threat. See, unlike the United States, the Warsaw Pact was a forced marriage held together with military force. Ukraine's nothing like New York in this sense. The Soviet Union literally fought wars against its own Warsaw Pact allies just to keep them in line. For all its sins, you don't see NATO attacking Poland every time it annoys the EU, which is basically daily. Equally, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved voluntarily, not forcibly, by Gorbachev himself, the leader of the Soviet Union. NATO did not force the Soviet Union to dissolve. A fundamentally flawed political system of expansionist communism did that all by itself. Equally with the missiles China would put in New York, the sovereign country. They'd be there by force. That's not the case with NATO. Ukraine actively wants the deterrent against the Russian threat. They're begging NATO to let them into the club. Alright, so if Jake's brain dead for making such a stupid comparison, what'd be a better one? Cuba's the first thing that comes to mind. It's a post-colonial sovereign independent nation with a distinct culture and identity that chose of its own volition to enter a military alliance with the Soviets. The Americans, if you recall, didn't like that very much and reacted very much like any arrogant great power reacts when a small nearby country tries to do shit they don't like. Invaded them a little, then sanctioned them into eternal poverty. That would be a somewhat closer comparison, but it's still just banal whataboutism rather than actual objective analysis. Ukraine's not New York, it's not Cuba, it's just Ukraine. There's no intellectual benefit to comparing 1970s Cuba to 2022 Ukraine. Its only purpose is to be like, oh, well, America was bad too. Yeah, I fucking get it, but this isn't a black and white issue. and using cherry-picked history to place all the blame on America's shoulders is just outright disingenuous contrarianism. I could argue the Russians are solely responsible for this situation because of their centuries worth of aggression towards their direct neighbours. You ask any Eastern European what they think about Russia and its government, it tends to range from ambivalence to outright disliking for this very reason. Tsarist Russia, then the Soviet Union, and now the modern Russian Federation all showed aggression and hostility to their bordering nations, often subjugating them and oppressing them with a toxic ideology and military force. Do you really blame them, Jake, for taking the Western option over more forced marriages to Russia? Eastern Europeans, for the most part, look to the prosperity and stability of Western nations as something they actively want to be a part of, economically and culturally speaking. Equally, they see Russia as a backwards, autocratic, aggressive, and unreasonable force directly on their border. I'm saying all of this, by the way, as someone who's actually ethnically Russian too. Half of my family are Russians. Russians who, in fact, ran to the West to escape Russia's tyrannical authoritarianism, much like Ukraine, Georgia, and all the rest are seeking to. I say this as someone who deplores American exceptionalism, Western interventionism, and economic colonization by the West. Despite all of these things connecting me to the Russian narrative, despite my genuine desire to cut Russia some slack and my genuine desire to throw shit at the Americans, even I can see that there are clear and valid reasons for Ukraine and other Eastern European nations to actively seek independence and protection from Russia. Now I'm going to go out on a limb here and say this war, like all wars, is the fault of both participants. The Americans share their blame for refusing to consider Russia's membership in NATO, for treating them as a lesser state in negotiations, and for continuing to push the issue with Russia, Ukraine, and NATO, despite having absolutely no genuine intention to give Ukraine an Article 5 guarantee. That, I think, is actually America's most insidious crime here, leading the Ukrainians down the primrose path, as John Mearsheimer put it, encouraging them to pursue membership in NATO, encouraging them to get defiant with the Russians, despite in reality having little to no intention to actually grant such a membership. America's point here was always just Russia doesn't control NATO, therefore we won't be bullied and our inbox will remain open for Ukraine's application. Not, I think, as the Ukrainians took it, NATO will protect you if you move towards membership, and Russia takes issue with that. I think they sort of jumped the gun a little bit on that one. Russia, though, bears its share of the blame for all the reasons that I've talked about. Like, why the fuck would rational Ukrainian actors choose a dying empire ruled by oligarchs with an economy smaller than Texas and an autocratic leader for life when they could be part of the free and prosperous Western European world? This all brings us to the Maidan protests, which Jake kind of insinuated were orchestrated by the US. I mean, fucking maybe. I'm no Chris Ray. I have no fucking idea. But to act like there wasn't always a fairly aggressive pro-Western tranche of the domestic Ukrainian population's ignorance. Half of Ukraine always wanted to be in NATO, in the EU, and that half of the population saw under Yanukovych their prospects of Western integration being permanently thwarted. So they did something about it, I guess. Yanukovych, for his part, responded by shooting people left, right, and centre, which is kind of actually what led to his downfall. The pro-Russian government's actions towards the protests, more than the protests themselves, are what felled Yanukovych's government. Likewise, no formal promise was ever made between either the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation and NATO regarding expansion. Oh, and the bombings in Yugoslavia happened because of a literal genocide in Kosovo that the UN was unable to respond to due to China's veto of the proposal. Maybe not NATO's finest moment from an international law perspective, but also Yugoslavia was never culturally Russian. It was actually heavily resisting Russian influence for a long-ass time. It's just not as relevant to the issue as Jake's making out it is. Basically, Jake's gone right ahead and given Putin some free propaganda with his video. He's basically given the Russian party line without any logical consideration of the complexity of the issue, without any attempt at fairness, and so on. It's like he researched his video exclusively with posts from r/Jen Zedong. As I said at the start, this stuff's real fucking complicated and all sides exist squarely in the moral grey. I don't think blame can be assigned to one side more than the other in terms of how we got here, but I do think it's a bit messed up to place the weight of all the dead Ukrainians upon American shoulders when it's Russians pulling the trigger at the end of the day. Overall, this was just a shit video that didn't really give the full scope of the issue. I'm not saying mine does, I'm as brain dead as anyone else, but when you've got close to 1 million people under your influence, I think it becomes a bit more of a responsibility not to mislead people en masse like that. I hope Jake can get back to making the content he's good at, that we all love from him, and this dumb fuck opinion can just fade into the history of his channel. He just dropped another video on the issue today. Though, so who knows. I really enjoyed the documentaries he used to make, as did basically everyone, but I don't think his audience is as behind the new political angle, to be honest. The dislikes on these videos show it. Anyway, guys and girls, if you fuck with the video, launch a fucking tactical nuke at that like button. If you think I'm a brain dead window licker, let me know in the comments. And if you're down for more shit content just like this, then chuck me a sub. Be sure to slap the bell as well so YouTube can still not give you any notifications anyway. That's all for tonight. See you cock goblins next time.